When I think of fruit, I think of nourishment to us all. In many cases, medicinal, handed down to mankind by the grace of nature. As a metaphor, fruit is also the offspring of hard work and endurance, evidence of perseverance during the toughest of times. Conversely, fruit can be associated with stereotypes and disdain, a way to cast others into primitive narratives, with or without their consent. But could this be subverted? Could someone take a symbol of savagery and simian characterization and pull power from it simply by the elegance of their skill and fortitude? This idea was put to the test in April of 1926 in Paris, France. A young African-American woman, age 19, stepped onto the stage at the famed Folies Bergère, a cabaret music hall known for displaying the sultry and the sensational as entertainment for the masses. The crowd sat in awe as a slender, beautiful black dancer entered the stage dressed in only a skirt made of rhinestone-studded bananas, thrusting and shaking her hips before them. In the midst of the performance, she would make funny faces and stare directly into the crowd, disarming them from the preconceptions that they held, while unknowingly shooting her own star power into a career that would last for the next 50 years, and at one time, making her the richest black woman in the world. 12 curtain calls later, a star named Josephine Baker was born. American by birth, French by citizenship, and an activist icon which changed the racial landscape by using the two things given to all of us to the best of her ability: her feet. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, Season 2, Episode 2. Thank you for joining me for the second episode of the second season. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you all for your continued support. And this is the support coming from around the world, actually. Each of you have been an intricate part in the meager success obtained in the past few months, and you are all truly, truly appreciated. And speaking of support, I'd like to give a special shout out to a creator I came across on the mean streets of Reddit who was kind enough to offer that support. Her name is Erin Carlson, host and creator of an exceptional podcast which reviews the life and work of some of our forgotten heroes. You can catch her show, Stars of the Golden Age, right now. And if I'm not mistaken, she currently has a newly posted episode about the great Louis Armstrong, which I found to be quite informative. So, when you get a chance, give her a listen. It will be worth the time, I promise you that. Having said that, we're going to get back to the subject of today's episode, the incomparable Josephine Baker. To begin, Frida Josephine McDonald was born on June 3, 1906, in an impoverished neighborhood in East St. Louis. Her mother, half black, half Native American, worked as a laundress, while her father, a trumpet player, abandoned the family while Josephine was in her infancy. By the age of 8, Josephine began working under circumstances which were not ideal. Domestic work, under the watchful eyes of racist employers who often forced her to work long hours and endure abuse that no child should ever encounter. At the time, the neighborhood was on the verge of racial tensions. These tensions came to a boiling point, culminating with the East St. Louis race riots of 1917. The violence, which included murder, was all seen by Josephine. It had a lasting impact on her, as would anyone with sighted eyes, so much so that she determined within herself that she would escape East St. Louis the first chance she got. The real question was how. This question was answered simply by happenstance. Josephine, like most children her age, enjoyed dancing, but unlike most children her age, due to her lanky frame and natural beauty, she excelled. so much so that within 2 years she found work dancing on tour with several bands and learning the ropes, so to speak. This was a blessing, of course. The road provided money and, at the very least, an escape from home. The road also brought suitors, and by the age of 15, Josephine was married and divorced, twice. The second husband giving her the name Baker, which she kept for the rest of her life. By 1919, she had bit parts with the Dixie Steppers, eventually finding work in New York as a chorus girl for the first all-black musical at the time, entitled Shuffle Along. And although that title is slightly disturbing to me, due to her comic timing and the way she seemed to entrance the audience on a nightly basis, she was soon to find herself in Europe, Paris to be exact, performing in shows labeled as elaborate spectacles and a primitive escape. Unlike America, Paris provided a level of freedom that the young Josephine had never experienced. Upon boarding a train, she could sit wherever she wanted. While eating at a restaurant, her food came in a timely manner, and she wasn't forced to enter and exit through the service door. Paris was slowly but surely becoming her home. After gaining fame due to her banana dance, Josephine became a bona fide celebrity. She began to be copied. Her hair, her style of dress, even her mannerisms became all the rage. Along with that came eccentricities, which became her calling card. She walked the streets with a leopard on a leash. Parrots and snakes were commonplace in her dressing room, and dozens of marriage proposals would arrive by mail on a weekly basis. After returning from Paris, fresh off a 2-year, 25-country tour, Josephine decided to open her own nightclub, Chez Josephine. Here she had control over her performances and the ambiance. No segregation allowed, no rowdy behavior, simply entertainment. The club was a success, and by 1929, Josephine became the richest black woman in the world with an estimated net worth of $1 million. That's roughly $17 million in today's money. With the newfound confidence and a bank account to match, Josephine returned to the States to perform at the world-renowned Ziegfeld Follies, a series of Broadway musicals with a 20-year run of success. But once the reviews came in, Josephine learned that although she had blossomed into a premier talent of Europe and Northern Africa, in America, the same racist undertones were alive and well. She was called a Negro wench, a horrible singer, a waste of one's time, while her co-stars were lauded as pure talent. Over 30 hotels turned her down, and the few that considered her demanded that she enter using the servants' entrance. Josephine had enough, and by 1936 she returned back to Paris, where she was greeted by hundreds of fans as her train entered the station. She went on to attain personal and professional heights, receiving her pilot's license, converting to Judaism, and even a short-lived marriage to Jean Léon, a French industrialist. But the marriage was somewhat doomed from the start. Josephine had several miscarriages, and she was far too famous to settle down and be a good housewife. Not to mention, with the likes of Pablo Picasso using her as a muse, and a brief affair with the likes of Frida Kahlo, among others, she clearly had an ambition that marriage could never contain. By the late 30s, the Nazis had begun their reign of terror across Europe, and by 1940, Hitler entered Paris, and by May of that year, France had become occupied by Germany, causing Josephine to flee to the south of France, where she purchased the Château de Méland. The property, although in dire need of renovation, became a safe haven for Josephine and even a hiding place for refugees and resistance fighters. And during the war, Josephine not only personally flew supplies all over Europe, she also, and this was due to her fame, became enlisted as a spy for the resistance. She attended embassy functions and parties as a simple celebrity guest, but unbeknownst to the attendees, she was also a spy, listening to every drunken conversation and passing statement she could and relaying that information to the resistance. One method she became known for was using her sheet music to write down all of the information she had attained for the night using invisible ink. which she promptly handed over to the French for further inquiry. Rumor has it that she was able to forewarn the French of Mussolini's involvement with the Nazis long before Italy had officially joined with Germany. Along with espionage, she performed for the Allied troops under the condition of no segregation, which was sometimes begrudgingly obliged. And by the end of the war, she received the Croix de Guerre for her service as an agent for the French resistance. By 1947, she remarried, this time to band leader and composer Joe Boyan. Immediately, all of her efforts went into the renovation of the chateau, but due to being light on funds due to the slowdown of the war, she decided to give America a chance again, touring only as a means to finance the renovation. During the tour, she was subject to threats by the KKK, and also good old-fashioned bigotry. This came to a head when in 1951, at the famous Stork Club, she grew livid after waiting over an hour to be served. There were many celebrities in attendance. One in particular, the journalist Walter Winchell, ended up being a lifetime foe after Josephine blasted him for not speaking up for her. Winchell, not being one to back down from anyone, promptly went on to his nationally syndicated radio show and accused her of being a racist, crazed, and an anti-Semite, an accusation which forced her tour to be canceled and prevented her from returning to the U.S. for almost 20 years. Upon returning back to the chateau, Josephine and Joe, well, mostly Josephine, decided to adopt, not only due to the fact that several miscarriages and illnesses had caused her to become infertile. Josephine also wanted to prove a point. She wanted to show the world that racism was a construct, a mirage made of fear and envy. And having that in mind, she began to adopt children from all over the world, black, white, Asian, her own rainbow tribe, as she called it. On the surface, this was an honorable act. Josephine was world famous, and the attention brought on by her collected family was an example of peace and inclusion that the world had never seen. But in reality, it was expensive. Josephine was gone for months at a time, and this was due to the need for the finances, and Joe found himself raising the children alone. And although the children loved him, some say more than Josephine, which she didn't like, the financial strain brought on by Josephine's projects and celebrity upkeep was too much to bear. When Josephine announced that she wanted to soon adopt a 9th child, Joe divorced her after 13 years of marriage, leaving her and her children to fend for themselves. And by 1961, she was bankrupt with several children to support. Enter 1963. America was a powder keg of racial tension. Murders and discrimination was at an all-time high, and Martin Luther King was the loud black voice of disruption. The March on Washington would be his proclamation of humanity. And by the intervention of Robert F. Kennedy, Josephine was invited to attend. Marching with over 200,000 people, Josephine was there, and although she had gained her French citizenship years ago, she felt obligated to join the struggle in any way that she could. She even spoke at the Lincoln Memorial, the only woman speaker, in fact. And although a small percentage of the crowd had no idea who she was, by the time she finished, she was met with applause and well wishes and welcoming, which she thought she'd never see. By 1964, back at the chateau, things started to take a turn for the worst. 12 children and 2 heart attacks in, Josephine was a ball of stress and financial uncertainty. By 1968, the staff was gone. The money had come to a halt, and Josephine and her 12 children found themselves at the mercy of creditors, eventually forced out of the chateau and into a 2-bedroom apartment surrounded by 2 dogs, 12 children, and a multitude of regret. But life wasn't quite done with her yet. As fate would have it, one of the patrons at the Stork Club so many years ago was Grace Kelly, now Princess of Monaco. She remembered the injustice done to Josephine that night and how she was so callously tossed to the wind simply because she decided to stick up for herself. After learning of Josephine's destitute place in life, she brought her to Monaco, where she was given a 4-room villa and booked immediately for a string of performances. Not only was this a grand gesture of respect and appreciation, it also was an opportunity, a chance to get out of debt and keep her self-esteem and family intact, an opportunity which Josephine humbly accepted and pounced upon. By 1973, at the age of 67, Josephine decided to once again return to New York for a string of concerts at Carnegie Hall, celebrating her years in the business. And although her dancing days were long behind her, she sang all of her hits from 1925 to that day. As usual, the critics tore the show to pieces. After performance at the Beverly Hilton in Los Angeles, an article in Variety magazine attacked her for not remembering the lyrics and rambling, ultimately calling her a has-been. Once again, the United States had proved to her that it simply did not appreciate her. The next year, she suffered another stroke and another heart attack. She was $200,000 in debt, and even her own children started to grow distant from her. But Josephine, ever the fighter, had one more round in the tank. In 1974, she staged a career retrospective in London, staged at a small theater. She wore her usual camp-like garb and brought her personality and gravitas to the forefront. By the end of the night, one thing became clear. She had a hit on her hands, and fans, young and old, were captivated by her once again. Her songs had gained a new life. The style and grace which she took over 60 years to harness had now become the talk of the town, all over again. After that night, the show was sold out for months, and Josephine could finally plot her way out of debt and uncertainty. But time had other plans for her. 4 days later, after making a few phone calls and eating breakfast, she decided to take a nap. Hours later, Josephine was discovered by staff unconscious, surrounded by rave reviews from multiple newspapers and magazines. Immediately rushed to the hospital, Josephine Baker died on April 12th, 1975, at the age of 68. Upon her death, she was given a military funeral with over 20,000 attendees. Even her ex-husband Joe paid his respects. Subsequently, there was a memorial held in Monaco, and Princess Grace, her good friend and source of support, even paid for the gravestone. For any other human being, this would be the end. A life lived, the ups and downs, etc., etc. But oddly enough, Josephine still wasn't done. On November 30th, 2021, Josephine Baker was inducted and buried in the French Pantheon. This was due to several factors: her service in the French resistance during World War II, her advocacy for civil rights and equality, her accomplishments in entertainment. For the unfamiliar, this is the highest honor a French citizen can be bestowed posthumously. Josephine Baker. A woman born poor in the slums of East St. Louis was now lionized, buried with the likes of Voltaire, Victor Hugo, Alexander Dumas, even Louis Braille, the inventor of the reading and writing method used by the blind and given his namesake. Josephine is one of only 6 women to be buried there and the only woman of African descent. Which brings me back to the concept of fruit. In the beginning of her career, the banana was her fruit of choice, a symbol of primitive beings eager to entertain, but by the end, that fruit had transformed itself into a little bit more than just a symbol. It became sustenance, a meal for any of us willing to ingest it, food for the soul, strength for a new day, energy as we walk the diverse paths of life and love. Thank you, Josephine. We'll be back in a moment. Thank you all for returning. I'd like to first and foremost say that for those of you listening in French-speaking nations, I do apologize if I butchered those words. I did my best, but the croix de jours and the sabon le blanc kind of messed with me. So I hope you'll accept my apology. Today, we're going to sort of continue with the theme. And the theme is pretty much the idea of love. It's Valentine's Day. Those of you listening probably have romantic things to do. And keeping with that, I'm going to begin the second half of the episode with the short story I like to call Echoes of Pink. To begin, more often than we'd like to admit, the thing we pay the least attention to can somehow become the most important. This was the case for Gaston Dill, a born leader and son of a dead woodcutter whose name isn't even worth mentioning. As a child, Gaston would routinely watch the smiles of strangers and relatives fade when the name of his father was spoken. He wasn't sure of the true reasons, but over time, eavesdropping provided enough information for him to assume that his father had gained a reputation for being unreliable and aloof, a man known to stare off into the distance during conversation and often misinterpret the words of an agreement, finding himself deep within the throes of debt and resentment. It was with that knowledge that Gaston made it his life's mission to be aware, particularly of matters pertaining to instruction and detail. Over time, the ability to listen became his saving grace. Gaston could be instructed on the intricacies of any subject one time and one time only, and still be able to recall that instruction with pinpoint accuracy. By the age of 10, he could not only build shelter and fashion traps and snares for the harsh winters based on memory, he was also able to teach those around him, regardless of age, with astonishing ease. This ability to absorb information eventually spilled over to his physical prowess as well. He'd spent years observing from a distance, watching the men of his village defend their land against a multitude of opposition. He paid close attention to the swordsmanship of battle, the defensive and offensive skills able to result in victory, and even the best formations used to gain a tactical advantage. When he became a fighting age, Gaston quickly moved through the ranks, and by the age of 18, he had led his village to victory in over 20 conflicts, as well as increased the land of his village several times over. He was respected, feared, and most importantly, loved, not because of the increase he provided, but because of the small things that made one become legendary. Gaston knew the names of every villager and their children, the names of their relatives and pets. He remembered birthdays, traditional dances, and even conversations that were years old. And he was able to recite those conversations at a moment's notice. Being a man of popularity and favor, when the time for marriage came around, he had his pick of virtually any woman his eyes fell upon. This included the daughters of the conquered, or even those offered to him by allies, but none of those women had his heart. To be specific, none had his heart the way Helena did. Gaston had known Helena since before he could remember, and although he never knew his mother, he was often told how strongly Helena resembled her in appearance and disposition. Unlike the other woman he'd been offered, Helena was considered plain. She was far from unattractive, but there was a timid nature about her which caused her to be overlooked by most. As children, she only spoke to Gaston. There was something magnetic which drew them to one another, so much so that between them they formed a pact, an agreement forged long before his abilities and fame had thrust him into leadership and desirability. The promise was simple. By the age of 18, if Gaston had not perished in battle, and Helena had not given her heart to another, they would marry. As children, this deal was sealed with a kiss underneath a pink magnolia tree, far from the eyes and ears of any other than the two of them. But Gaston, he always remembered. He remembered the softness of her lips, the way the wind whisked her hair to the left side of her cherubic cheeks, and how their hearts seemed to meld together, forming a love that not even time could tear apart. He reminded her of this often, whether in passing or upon returning from a conflict. He made it a point to remind Helena of their childhood pledge. She would never respond. She would simply nod and smile as a silent acceptance of a love that would soon be fulfilled. As fate would have it, on the morning of Gaston's 19th birthday, a messenger sent from Gladshire, the largest city in the land and home of Queen Lorna, entered the village on horseback. Underneath his arm, he carried a large scroll which he unfurled before the townspeople slowly and with indifference, so much so that a few older villagers didn't bother to even stop and listen. This was certainly abnormal. Most decrees came by rumor or warning, and having a messenger of the queen appear so abruptly was cause for attention at the very least. As soon as the crowd became of a decent size, the messenger spoke with a loud and hurried boom, saying, hear ye, by decree of Queen Lorna, ruler of this land and all who inhabit it. You are invited to send one of your bravest men to compete for the hand of her youngest daughter, Princess Celestina. This will take place in Gladshire 1 week from today. The contestant of your choosing must be unwed and without child, known or unknown. The contestant must also be free of any disease, mental or physical. Details to follow upon arrival. With that, the messenger galloped off to the next village, leaving the townspeople in a clamor of murmurs and giggles. Among those in the crowd was Helena, who was in the midst of purchasing a sheath from a leathersmith which she had made special for Gaston's birthday. The sheath was made from the finest hides in the kingdom, with the letters G and H etched into the side, taking months to construct. She had saved every coin she could gather for years to purchase the gift, and by the time she handed over the hard-earned coins to the leathersmith, stained with dirt and time, her anxious heart beat so fast that she felt weak to the point that she was forced to spend a few moments leaning against a post, watching as some of the men began to speak amongst themselves in an ever-increasing din of whispers and hearty laughter. It didn't take long until the whispers began to yield an audible name, which she heard sporadically mixed with nods and grunts of approval. The name, of course, was Gaston. By the time she reached Gaston's small cruck house on the outskirts of the village, a large group of men were already there. As she came closer to the crowd, she was struck by the sounds of continued laughter and cheers that echoed from the center. After peeking over a set of broad shoulders, she saw Gaston smiling in the middle of the crowd and encircled by snickers from the men and pats on the back. As soon as her eyes locked, the smile on Gaston's face turned to a stiff frown. Knowing what had come to pass, Helena dropped the newly purchased sheath and ran away, tears streaming from her face. That night, as she lay in her bed, heartbroken, a whisper from outside her window shook her from her daze. Helena, it's me, Gaston. Helena looked to see Gaston, crouching in the distance with his hands behind his back. Meet me at our hiding place, squeaked Gaston, careful to keep low and veiled by shadow. From her window, Helena's heart betrayed her mind, and instantly a smile and nod released from her body like a reflex. Under a shimmering moon, Helena met with Gaston under their pink magnolia tree. In his hand, he held the sheath that she had left behind, and on his face, he had a mischievous scowl, almost teasing her pain. You intend to break our promise. Your promise, said Helena, while holding back tears. Don't be silly, replied Gaston. Of course not. Before he could continue, Helena jolted into his arms and held him tightly, weeping into his chest until, It'll be fun. You'll see it. It's the adventure of it, said Gaston with a grin. It's not like I have a chance. So you're going, snapped Helena, wiping the tears from her face with her wrist. Well, yes, but not to win, Helena. You are the one for me. There's no doubt about that. Then why go? Replied Helena, trembling with insecurity. because one day I'll be an old man with you and our children by my side, and I'll get to tell the tale of how I represented our township in this silly competition, and I'll exaggerate about how I almost won, but my love for you brought me back to your arms, and we lived happily ever after. But what if you win? Said Helena, growing more insecure by the moment. I won't, replied Gaston. But what if you do? What then? What about me? What about us? Gaston took a moment to pause, then wiped a remaining tear from her face. I won't, said Gaston. Besides, from what I hear, the princess isn't much to look at all, and the fact that there's a competition only magnifies how desperate the situation is. Then don't go, said Helena. Let our love be the story you tell our children. Gaston paused again, trying to produce words that would allow Helena to understand, but after moments of silence, save for the sound of rustling leaves and crows in the distance, the only words he could conjure were, I'll be back, I promise. Stunned, Helena placed her hand over her heart and through tears replied, You remember so much, even the smallest details of a thing. I only hope that you will remember this. Go onward. Overcome despair. Be your everything. Puzzled, Gaston stood still as Helena kissed him on the cheek and walked towards her home, leaving Gaston with his thoughts and the sound of the pink magnolias tossed about by the wind. The next morning, Gaston exited the township in his finest clothes on a mighty horse, with his sword tucked tightly in the leather sheath given to him by Helena. On either side of him, a handful of men and boys followed along, chanting his name and cheering him forward until he departed the township boundary. The road to Glatshire was fairly uneventful. The nights were cool and restful, the days draped in sunshine and silent contemplation. Gaston found excitement in the unknown. He treasured his ability to adapt and learn quicker than most, and by the time he entered Glatshire, he couldn't help but feel hopeful. Not only due to the adventure that awaited him, but within him, he held no doubt that Helena would forgive his curiosity. And when he returned, full of tales and feats of the imagination, she would understand, and they would marry shortly thereafter. Upon entering the city gates, Gaston was struck by the size of the city. Merchants and beggars, owners and employees milled about a multitude of shops and ornate buildings at a rapid pace. In an instant, an argument would erupt, followed by a thief being chased away from an establishment. Each second was a sensory rush, and he enjoyed every moment of it. After traveling towards the center of the city, he began to notice men who seemed out of place, men of different nationalities and sizes, men of different tongues, some with scarification on their faces and head. Some were dressed in clothing he recognized, while others were adorned in fine silks and animal skins he'd never seen before. In their hands, various weapons of varying size. Tools and talismans hung from their sides and necks. Some attached flags, crests, and identifiers from their homelands to their horses in an attempt to honor their clans and houses. These men all gathered toward the center, all eager to begin the competition. Briefly, Gaston felt intimidated. The majority of his competitors stood several inches taller than him, muscular and sharp-witted, but before he could give his emotions further space, the sound of a trumpet blared, followed by a messenger standing on a balcony above the townspeople, scroll in hand. After clearing his throat, the messenger spoke, saying, Queen Lorna, ruler of the Eastern Front, would like to welcome you all to a competition like none other. Those of you who have chosen to embark upon this task will each have a chance at the hand of Princess Celestina, but only one of you shall win. For now, join us in the royal banquet hall. We have prepared a feast, as well as an introduction to the princess before the games begin. Once again, we'd like to thank you all for your participation. and may the crown be with you." Exiting to a flurry of trumpets, the messenger stepped away from the balcony. Below, the men, including Gaston, proceeded through the city and into the banquet hall. Ever looking for an advantage, Gaston stayed mindful, paying attention to his surroundings and his opponents. Simple conversations between the men that were within his earshot were stored in his brain for safekeeping. Conversations about nervousness, overconfidence, and perceived intelligence compartmentalized and categorized in his brain for later. Upon entering the hall, the men were escorted to their seats by servants based on the order of their arrival. Those larger men who managed to muscle their way through the crowd quickly retrieved the first few rows of seats, while the smaller or uninterested took whatever seats were left over. Front and center of the hall, an empty table with tall chairs all facing forward stood in anonymity. Gaston arrived towards the end of the crowd and promptly sat towards the back, next to several of the smaller, more malnourished attendees. Each table held 2 to 3 large turkeys, roasted potatoes, freshly baked bread, and several pitchers of ale and wine. Gaston paid close attention to those who filled their goblets with alcohol, but he paid even closer attention to those who did not, he being one of them. Quickly scanning the room, Gaston observed the number of men to be close to 40. Some exercised patience, as if they were waiting to be told to eat, while others ripped turkey legs from the carcasses and began filling their plates without hesitation. As Gaston began to eat, again, the sound of trumpets filled the hall. Suddenly, several of the Queen's guards entered, dressed in armor and chainmail. Each man strategically settled at all corners of the hall, their eyes facing the front. Suddenly, a large set of double doors opened and in walked 2 women in their late 30s, clearly royalty and clearly uncomfortable. They seemed ill, and their faces only hinted at beauty long gone. Gaston watched as each woman took a seat at the once empty table and waited patiently, all while secretly hoping that either one of them was not Princess Celestina. A few seconds later, Queen Lorna entered, flanked by more guards, and escorted to her seat at the center of the front table. The Queen was old, much older than Gaston expected. She walked hunched over and belabored, and her face was a virtual sea of wrinkles and stress. On her head was a magnificent golden crown fitted with rubies and diamonds, and her clothing was pure silk, blue and yellow lining. Before sitting, the Queen stopped to survey the room, paying close attention to each of the men. She did not smile. She did not frown. In fact, she gave no real emotion, just a careful accounting of the room. More silence lingered until the Queen finally spoke, saying, "Before most of you were born, my husband, the late King Phineas, had a dream. A dream to one day pass the kingdom down to a male heir, but the gods saw fit to grant us only daughters. 6 to be exact. 3 of them died in their youth. The 2 before you now were afflicted with barren wombs. Now the only hope we have lies with our last daughter, number 6, my dear Celestina. There have been many suitors, men greater than all of you, but the one thing they lacked was character, things that a leader would be lost without. Now, after many failed attempts over several years, I have decided to hold this competition. One that would not only test the strength of one's muscles, but the strength of mind and character. Upon conclusion of this feast, each of you will have 24 hours to enter the southern entrance of the Gladshire Forest and exit the northern ridge. The first one of you to endure the many tests and trials that lie ahead of you and exit before the rising of the sun will win my daughter's hand in marriage. Are there any questions?" Queen Lorna searched the room for anyone with even a hint of curiosity, but to her surprise, no one spoke. Befuddled, Lorna opened her mouth again to speak, but before she could, one of the large men from the front row raised his hand. The man wore armor made of elephant tusks and gold rings which sectioned his long red beard into 2 equal parts, holding his nose high into the air as if his very presence was a blessing to them all. "You there," said Queen Lorna. "What is your question?" The large man stood with a smirk and addressed the room, saying, "Your Majesty, I am Dintar, son of Moraz, a magistrate from Vanteg, one of your recently annexed neighbors." "Go on," said the queen, keeping a close ear to his tone. "With all due respect, your daughters here before us aren't very appealing, and if it's allowable, I think I speak for most of us by saying, can we see this Celestina? I don't think that any of us came all this way to journey back home with royal trash. With all due respect, of course." Gasps peppered the room in palpable appall. "I see," said the queen while holding her grace. 3 men seated behind Gaston burst into laughter before catching themselves. The remaining men stewed in tension until, without hesitation, Queen Lorna looked to her guards, who promptly approached and slit the throat of Dintar and the 3 men who dared laugh in her presence. Under the sound of gurgling and the writhing of their fading bodies, Lorna patiently waited until all 4 men took their last breaths. Once completed, their lifeless bodies were dragged out of the banquet as the room faced forward in complete silence. Lorna again cleared her throat, saying, "It is important that you understand that I love my daughters very much. I will not tolerate any disrespect, especially the kind that ridicules their appearance and physical limitations. Having made that clear, I present to you my youngest daughter, Princess Celestina." Gaston, along with all the men in the room, focused their attention on the double doors. Moments later, Princess Celestina, dressed in a long white gown, entered the room and sat beside her mother. To say that she was beautiful would be far too common of a term. She was, in fact, beauty personified. Her hair was neat and shiny, comprised of 2 braids that ran alongside her back, drawing attention to her shapely figure. Her eyes were a deep, mesmerizing hazel. Her lips were supple and only second to her tremendous bosom, which protruded over the top of her gown like bubbles on the surface of water. The room simmered with mumblings and groans. Gaston himself didn't realize his mouth was open until a nearby fly entered it. The truth of the matter became quite obvious. Celestina was indeed a prize worth winning, and this competition had now changed from a task taken on a whim to a mission filled with purpose and prestige. Feeling the pressure in the room, the men began to straighten their clothing and sit upright. Those who minutes earlier joked and drank heavily set their drinks to the side and lowered their voices in an attempt to assert their dominance. "Now that you all have had a chance to view what the departed called royal trash," said Queen Lorna, "I'd like Celestina to say a few words. Celestina." Meek and demure, Celestina arose as her mother sat. On the verge of tears, Celestina addressed the room, saying, "Thank you all for coming." Her voice was small and composed. Many of the men had to lean forward to hear her clearly, but the one thing she had was their full attention. "There isn't much to say to you," whispered Celestina. "In truth, I have never been anywhere near Gladshire Forest, so I have no advice to give. What I can say is that I am much more than my appearance, more than my family's wealth. I have a mind, heart, and aspirations that a man would find much more valuable than what the eyes can see. Having said that, I am told that each of you are to meet at the entrance of the forest before dawn, and whoever exits first will be my betrothed." Celestina paused and surveyed the room, and for a brief moment her eyes fell upon Gaston, sending an electric shock through his bones, causing him to catch his breath. "I do have one bit of advice," said Celestina. And this will be the last thing most of you will hear me say. Let intuition shine. Trust every notion. With that, Celestina, her two sisters, and Queen Lorna exited the banquet hall, leaving Gaston and the rest of the contestants to ponder their wildest imaginations. The next morning, at the crack of dawn, Gaston and 35 of the bravest men in the kingdom stood before the opening of Gladshire Forest with bated breath. Nailed to a tree, a list of instructions stated the following. You have 24 hours. Enter only when ready. Death or wisdom is the only escape. Standing beside a tree, a servant boy stood holding a cowbell high above his head. Once it was apparent that all of the men had read and understood the sign to the best of their ability, the servant boy rang the bell as hard as his thin arms would allow. At once, all of the men, some on horseback, some on foot, removed their weapons from their respective bonds and rushed into the forest in a stampede of machismo and lust, all except Gaston, who calmly sat on the ground, listening to the sounds of birds chirping under sunrise. In the distance, from within the forest, swords clanking and screams could be heard sporadically rising and falling at will. Once the sound had completely faded, Gaston stood to his feet, mounted his horse, and entered the Gladshire Forest, eyes and ears wide open. Upon entrance, Gaston was struck by the thick canopy of trees which completely blocked all sunlight. Instantly, the day became night, and all that was before him was a simple trail of footfalls from his fellow competitors which crushed the grass beneath them. Having enough sense not to follow the crowd, Gaston circumnavigated the path before him and walked through an uncleared mass of trees and plant life. After traveling a few feet, he entered into a clearing only to find 10 of the men lying dead with what appeared to be self-inflicted wounds. Paying close attention to the bodies, Gaston dismounted his horse and knelt. Noticing that the eyes of the dead men were wide open and their faces were frozen in fear. As his head focused toward the ground, a menacing giggle echoed through the forest. The ground beneath him began to rumble as a voice whispered, "See only what the blind feel." Instantly, the ground became a mirror, reflecting a hellscape of burning bodies and imps leaping and cascading through the skyline. Looking to find his reflection, Gaston saw a devilish figure, fat and slobbering, snarling at him with sharpened teeth and sunken eyes. Backing away from the image, Gaston unsheathed his sword and prepared himself for battle. But before he allowed himself to be overtaken by fear, a thought crossed his mind. His horse was calm, unbothered. Surely these dead men have seen the same thing as him, but what if that was their undoing? With that, he lowered his sword and closed his eyes. Suddenly, the menacing voice spoke again. "Solve the riddle, and you may proceed." "Speak," shouted Gaston, his eyes pinched closed. Again, the menacing laugh swelled until softly a voice spoke, saying, "To some I am lost, to some I am found. I am silent in mind, yet the loudest of sounds. What am I?" Eyes closed, hearing the torments that proceeded from the mirrored vision below, Gaston calmed himself until an answer struck his intellect. "Focus! You are focus!" yelled Gaston in an earnest panic. Instantly, the sound of birds and the rustling of wind filled his ears, followed by the voice saying, "Well done. You may proceed." Gaston opened his eyes to see that the ground had returned to normal and another clearing appeared before him, allowing him and his horse to move forward. Miles and hours later, the adrenaline rush of fear and dread had long subsided, and Gaston found himself growing bored. The forest seemed to have no end, simply trees and an occasional rodent and the pangs of hunger to keep him company. As he traveled aimlessly, he passed by a set of pink magnolia trees, swaying in the wind, petals falling to the ground in intermittent gusts. As he passed beneath them, a petal landed on his horse's mane, causing thoughts of Helena to enter his mind. He remembered her smile, their first kiss, the look of pain on her face the last time he saw her. I am a fool, he thought to himself. As quickly as the thought entered his mind, a rush of ice-cold wind snatched the idea from his psyche as soon as it entered his lungs. Snow began to fall in flurries, then squalls, and suddenly a full-fledged snowstorm surrounded him. He continued forward until before him a 35-foot mound of snow set before him, blocking his path. Upon dismounting his horse, Gaston removed his sword from his sheath and began to cut away at the mound with reckless abandon. As he chopped at the snow, thrusting and pummeling with broad sweeps, a thick red liquid began to ooze through. Stopping immediately, Gaston removed the loose snow from the mound until a bloodied hand emerged, causing Gaston to fall back in disgust. After gathering himself, he reapproached the mound and removed the snow until it revealed a leg, then a face, then another face. The faces were familiar. Two of the competitors were now there, dead, before him. He continued to dig, this time with more ferocity, revealing another body, and another. By the time he removed the snow, 10 more dead bodies, frozen stiff, stood stacked before him, one on top of the other, in an assortment of clothing and useless weapons. Before he could gather his thoughts, the snow around him began to swirl and build until 4 faceless creatures, completely comprised of snow, stood before him. In each of their hands, a sword made of ice glistened in the light. Gathering his courage, Gaston retrieved his sword and stood in a fighting stance as the creatures moved in his direction. Looking to gain an advantage, Gaston attempted to mount his horse, but before his foot could enter the first stirrup, his horse reared up, causing Gaston to fall to the ground, only to watch the horse run off and disappear into the snowy mist. Now, Gaston stood, sword at the ready, as the creatures encircled him, their swords pointed at his torso. From there, a fierce struggle ensued. One by one, Gaston engaged with each creature in swordplay, slashing and chipping away at them with great skill. He managed to behead one of the creatures, then another, leaving him to fight 2-on-1 at an accelerated pace. The final 2 creatures were worthy opponents, dodging each parry in advance with ease. This exchange continued far longer than Gaston expected, through snow and wind and near misses, until Gaston managed to kick one of the beasts to the ground, long enough for him to remove the head of the other. Suddenly, as the fallen creature rose to his feet, he lifted his icy blade to the sky, causing the barrage of snow to fall harder than ever, completely blinding him from Gaston's view. Focused yet fearful, Gaston began to swing his sword wildly in every direction, screaming and panting while trying to inflict an injury to a foe he could no longer see. Without warning, an icy blade gashed his arm. Moments later, his leg, then the other. As panic began to fill his heart, Gaston remembered the answer to the first riddle. Focus. Attempting to orientate himself to his surroundings, he faced downward, focusing on his feet. There he noticed not only his footprints, but the prints of the creature as a pattern began to emerge. The creature was behind him. Its footprints were left to right in a semicircle, mere feet behind his. Without a moment's hesitation, Gaston, head down, stepped into the middle of the semicircle, sword up, knowing that the creature would be on either side of him. Once there, he waited and waited longer, and then closed his eyes until the snowy crunch of the creature's footfall was heard at his left. Calculating his opponent's next move, Gaston quickly lifted his sword, blocking the creature's blow, allowing him to make one final swift chop. Moments later, The snow-covered head of the monstrosity rolled to Gaston's feet. From there, the snowstorm subsided. The sun shone through the trees, and the body of the snow beast began melting, leaving a furrowed scroll on the ground in its place. Picking up the scroll, Gaston opened it to find another riddle, which read, "You could pay me, but there is no cost. If you divide me, you are truly lost. What am I?" Perplexed, Gaston repeated the riddle several times until the answer became apparent. "Attention," moaned Gaston through the pain of his wounds. "You are attention." The ground began to shake, clearing a path for Gaston to proceed. At the opening, standing in wait with a snort, his horse calmly lowered himself enough for Gaston to climb his back. Tired, but happy to see him, Gaston patted his horse on the neck and chuckled, then winced. The horse neighed in acknowledgement, and they continued forward. As the sun began to set and the forest grew darker by the second, Gaston's bloodied body began to grow weaker. Along the way, bodies of fallen competitors who had succumbed to their wounds lay deceased on the side of the trail. Gaston counted 8 men, which meant that only 7 remained. Ignoring his pain and embracing his competitive spirit, Gaston gripped the reins of his horse and kicked its sides with the back of his feet, signaling the horse to run. With tremendous speed, the horse traveled the path ahead as Gaston held on for dear life. Later, as the moon began to rise, a feeling of loss started to overwhelm him. Surely the competition has come to an end, thought Gaston. I should not have waited in the beginning. I should have been mindful of this time. As these thoughts and more rained down on him, a firelight shone in the distance ahead. As he came closer, the same servant boy from the beginning stood before a small wooden cabin holding a torch. Beside him, an empty royal carriage stood, dormant under the moonlight. "Am I too late?" asked Gaston while frantically dismounting. The servant ignored him and simply opened the door to the cabin. Upon entering, Gaston was met by a sight that eased him as well as caused great distress. Seated at the back of the cabin before a roaring fireplace sat Celestina and Queen Lorna, flanked by a guard on either side. Seated on the floor, the remaining 7 contestants sat in a state of confusion and anger, mumbling to themselves as the queen and princess watched patiently. Slowly, Gaston approached the queen and princess and bowed before them. "What now?" said Gaston while stealing glances around the room. Queen Lorna, in all of her royal majesty, looked to Gaston with a half smile and spoke, saying, "You have come far, yet if you have not focused and paid attention, all you have endured will be for naught. Are you ready for the last challenge?" Yes, of course, replied Gaston. "What is it?" "Before we begin," said Celestina, "what is your name?" "My name is Gaston Dill, and I intend to win." "Good, Gaston," replied Celestina with a half smile. "Your final challenge is this. What was the first letter of each word of the last sentence I said at the banquet?" "What?" said Gaston, while making a failed attempt to hide his agitation. "Would you like a hint?" said Lorna, while craning her neck to the other men in the room. They were given one as well. "Yes," replied Gaston begrudgingly. "Please do." Clearing her throat, Queen Lorna responded, saying, "It's all a woman ever requires a man to do, but it rarely ever happens. That is your clue. You have until daybreak." Finding a seat on the floor, Gaston joined the other men in muttering to themselves, replaying every moment that came to mind. Celestina's dress, her face, even her bosom. The only thing that couldn't come to the forefront was her actual words. Gaston, like all the other men, were too focused on her beauty to bother focusing on her words. In truth, this was embarrassing. Gaston had trained his entire life for moments like this, but now, tired and covered in his blood and bravery, nothing came to mind. Minutes passed, then hours, and as the night sky began to turn blue, then orange, the men had no answer to give, and the rising sun set an end to the competition. With sunlight grazing their faces, Queen Lorna and Celestina stood to their feet and began to exit the cabin. The men started to grow rowdy, but the guards quickly drew their weapons, causing their outrage to settle. Standing at the threshold of the cabin, Celestina turned to the men, saying, "The last sentence I said was this: let intuition shine. Trust every notion." The first letter of each word was L-I-S-T-E-N. All any of you had to do was listen. Dumbfounded, Gaston and the other men lowered their heads in disappointment as the queen and princess exited the cabin, stepped onto the carriage, and rode off beneath the chirping of birds. Left alone, a few of the men began to curse and cry and punch the cabin walls, but Gaston, tired and frankly embarrassed, released a laughter so loud and so long that by the time he finished, he barely noticed that the cabin was now empty. Later that day, atop his horse, headed back to his village, Gaston continued to chuckle. He had his adventure, and although he lost, he did achieve a story that he could tell Helena and their children for the rest of his life. He almost felt a sense of relief, until suddenly, out of nowhere, Helena's last words spoken to him replayed in his mind. "Go onward, overcome despair, be your everything. G-O-O-D-B-Y-E. G-O-O-D-B-Y-E. Gobsmacked, Gaston grabbed the reins of his horse with whatever bit of strength he had left, and with the back of his feet, kicked the horse in its side with so much force that the horse bolted east toward home, leaving a thick plume of dust behind him. After riding several hours and finally reaching the village, the horse collapsed in the town square, leaving Gaston to search for Helena by foot. Grunting and limping his way through town and to the fields leading to Helena's home, Gaston could hear the sounds of a flute and cheers echoing through the air. Fighting to reach her, Gaston made one final push over a large hill, only to find Helena and the leathersmith standing underneath the pink magnolia tree, surrounded by friends and family, sealing their nuptials with a kiss. Thank you all for joining me for the second episode of the second season of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. I'd like to thank you all for actually listening to this one. This is rather long, but I do appreciate you guys kind of going all the way through. As always, you can always reach me at swtomail@gmail.com. That is swtomail@gmail.com. Once again, if you guys do get the chance, please go over to the Stars of the Golden Age podcast and give Erin a listen. She's a talented creator, and like myself, we are just basically trying to tell stories and trying to have an informative and historical lean. Having said that, as always, I appreciate you all, and most importantly, above all things, please be mindful of the stories you tell yourself, and happy Valentine's Day.